She was entering something marvelous in which all was passion, ecstasy, and delirium. But Rodolphe is not a guy to place a big bet on. What she does, they plan to go off. She plans that they will go off together, they'll live together. She has a child now. Rodolphe has no intention of running off with Emma Bovary. His intention is to leave her in the lurch. And the prose there about Rodolphe's dismissal of Emma, 176, is really quite remarkable. It's at the very beginning of chapter 13 of part 2. As soon as Rodolphe arrived home, he sat down quickly at his desk under the stag's head, another trophy, that hung as a trophy on the wall. But once the pen was in his hand, he could not think of anything. So leaning on his elbows, he began to reflect. And this happens a couple of times in the book. It also happens with Emma when people have to write something, they can't think of anything. And this is Flaubert's, in some ways a joke, in some ways a criticism, because they are trying to live out things in their lives rather than trying to write them out as art. And living them out in their lives is disastrous for all. He starts trying to remember these women in his life. He tries even trying to remember Emma. He says, and he can't, even though he's just been with her. He looks at a box full of mementos. He sees a miniature of Emma. He found her clothing pretentious and her sidelong gaze most pitiful in its effect. Then he's looking at this picture of her. He's studying this picture and summoning up a recollection of the original. Emma's features gradually became confused in his memory, as if the living face and the painted face, rubbing together, had obliterated each other. He has no notion of the real Emma. He's living with an image of Emma, and she's been living with an image of Rodolphe. They don't really know each other. They're using each other, we would say today. And so he's trying to recall Emma and all these other women he's slept with, all these other women he's seduced. But sometimes he can't recall anything at all. Indeed, Flaubert writes at the bottom of 176, these women, flocking into his thoughts all at the same time, impeded and diminished one another, as though leveled by the sameness of his love. And picking up fistfuls of disordered letters, he amused himself for a few minutes, letting them fall in cascades from his right hand to his left. What a load of nonsense, he says, which summed up his opinion. For his pleasures, Flaubert writes, for his pleasures, like school children in a schoolyard, had so trampled his heart that nothing green grew there. That's so great. Like school children in a schoolyard had so trampled his heart that nothing green could grow there. And whatever passed through it, more heedless than the children, did not even leave behind its name, as they did, carved on the wall. So then he writes a bunch of cliches to Emma, telling her that he's gone. Well, we have to move along more quickly, I guess. I love sharing these passages with you, and perhaps in your posts to one another in the fora, you will share with one another passages from Flaubert that you find particularly compelling or interesting or outrageous, if you will, because the outrageous stuff is coming. You know, Emma is very sick after Rodolphe leaves her. She is really distraught. She becomes depressed, we would say today, but eventually wakes up when Charles takes her to Rouen, a smallish city, a provincial city, where they bump into Léon at the opera, at a great romantic opera, actually, and we could talk more about that in the fora. But for our purposes, what's important is she meets Léon there, and when she meets Léon, she, this time, and both of them, for this time, they're not going to just have this affair in their head. They decide to have an affair, and while they have this affair, they become more and more distant from the truth of their situations. Léon is compromising his workplace relations, and eventually he actually retreats to being a good clerk, as he always had been. Emma, however, is pursuing her romantic desires more and more fervently and lying more and more to Charles so she can continue her affair. And it's at times hard to understand whether her affair with Léon is what's really driving her, or is the pleasure of lying, the pleasure of escaping her humdrum life, if that's really driving her. As you know, the seduction scene, this is a famous seduction scene. Flaubert got a lot of trouble for it. They're in a church in Rouen, and the priest is telling them all of these, giving them a tour about all of the sights to see within the cathedral. And Léon finally gets her into a carriage. How? He says, "Oh, they all do it in Paris. They all do it in Paris." And so for Emma, that was, wow, that just like the clothes she got for riding horseback with Rodolphe. They do it in Paris. Well, I guess I should be like that. I should be like the woman in Paris. And so she and Léon start their affair having sex in a carriage, because they drive around Rouen. And then for much of the rest of this last part of the book, they are desperate lovers. Emma desperately lying to Charles, as she also becomes more and more in debt. We haven't talked about that. This character, l'heureux, Monsieur Happiness, as you translate l'heureux, who is a figure who keeps coming up to satisfy Emma's commercial taste. He keeps loaning her money so she can buy clothes and other things, and eventually the financial house collapses. That is, she has so many debts that Charles doesn't know about, that they foreclose on her house, they foreclose on everything. Just like her erotic life, her romantic life collapses. She's borrowed her desires, too, from books. She's borrowed her desires from images. And in the end, she's been living on credit, we might say. And the credit dries up. Everything's going to collapse. And so the only alternative is the real world, the world of Homais, the world of boredom, of pseudo-rationality. And Emma wants no part of it. And so she kills herself. The only person who really loves her is Justin in the book. Well, maybe Charles, you might say. But she goes to Justin, she takes this arsenic, and she imagines she's going to have a romantic death. Oh, I don't feel so bad. And then, of course, it works its awful, awful way through her body, and she dies in a horrific manner that shocked readers in the 19th century. They were shocked by the descriptions of the pain she suffered, of the physical distress she was in. They were shocked by she grabbing the crucifix and giving it a love kiss, as Flaubert says. You know, Flaubert is breaking all these taboos at the end of Madame Bovary, and as Emma dies, romantic illusions are falling away. And I do think Emma actually realizes that just before she commits suicide. In one of her last trips to Rouen, she goes to the convent she finds herself near the convent where she had been a student, and she has what I would say is a kind of epiphany. It's in chapter 6 of part 3. In this edition we've been using, it's on 252. She's sitting by the convent, and she says, "Don't I love Léon?" And she doesn't really feel love. It didn't matter. It didn't matter. She was not happy and never had been. Why was life so inadequate? Why did the things she depended on turn immediately to dust? Yet if somewhere there existed a strong, handsome being with a valorous nature at once exalted and refined, with the heart of a poet in the shape of an angel, a lyre with strings of brass sounding elegiac epithalamiums to the heavens, then why mightn't she by chance find him? That's her romantic side again coming up. But then she says, oh, how impossible. And anyway, nothing was worth the difficulty of such a search. That's this realization. Nothing was worth the difficulty of such a search. Everything was a lie. Every smile hid a yawn of boredom. Every joy a malediction. Every pleasure its own disgust. And the sweetest kisses left on your lips no more than a vain longing for a more sublime pleasure. The sweetest kisses left on one's lips no more than a vain longing, no more than a vain longing for a more sublime pleasure. That's what Emma realizes at the convent. But it's too late to save her. But it is a realization, at least that Flaubert shares with the reader. Chasing satisfaction of desire in the real world is not going to cut it. It's not going to work. So Emma dies. She has this horrible death of suicide. They do an autopsy of Charles, who dies. Well, before Charles dies, we have to say he finds the letters. Remember, at the end of the novel, he finds Rodolphe's letters. He goes to see Rodolphe. It's this pitiful scene. He's looking across the table, and Rodolphe is wondering what this guy's going to do. Is he going to hit me or something? And he's not that afraid of Charles, but Charles just looks at him as if, I want to be you. I want to be you, the person she loved. Charles dies. They do an autopsy. They find nothing. Berthe goes off to work in a factory. It's such a pessimistic ending. And then the joke ending is that who prospers? Homais. He gets his Légion d'honneur. The Enlightenment wins at the end of Emma Bovary's story, but the winnings are horrible. The Enlightenment wins, but the winnings is the triumph of stupidity and of cliché and of convention. Emma's striving ends in death, but Homais' striving ends in reward because the society is so pathetically unjust and dumb. It's really Flaubert's view, stupid bet. The society has become riddled with stupidity. And so what do you do about that? You make art. You write a great novel. You strive to write perfectly. And that's what Flaubert aimed at. He wanted to write the perfect sentence. He didn't want to try to change society for the better, try to get the perfect drug, try to get the perfect farm equipment, try to get the perfect social order. No. He just wanted to write the perfect sentence because that he could control. Showing through perfect sentences how awful the world was, that was a great thing. So Flaubert is turning to art away from history. He talks about the author as a God in his universe, and that the author should not have passion about causes, not have passion about changing things in the world. As he says, passion, he writes this to his own mistress, passion does not make verses. The more personal you are, the weaker. The less you feel a thing, the more capable you are of expressing it as it is. Expressing it as it is. And here is what Flaubert's project is about. Getting it right, expressing things as they are, but doing so in a perfect form. Form becomes so important for Flaubert, and form becomes important for modernism. Flaubert is not worried about inequality, as was Rousseau and Marx. Flaubert thinks there is inequality. You have this letter to Louise Collet from 1852. He says, to have talent, you must be convinced that you possess it. And to keep your conscience pure, you must set it above everybody else's. The way to live serenely in clean, fresh air is to install yourself on some pyramid, no matter which, provided it be lofty and have a solid foundation. Ah, he writes, it isn't always amusing up there, and you are absolutely alone on the top of the pyramid. But there is some consolation in spitting from so high a place. That's Flaubert. Sit at the top of the pyramid, write the perfect sentences. But the perfect sentences also have to be about what's really going on in the world. That's the tension in Flaubert. He says to his lover, you have to go into the society, but you should go into society. He says, he uses this analogy, like wearing a condom, like a condom for your soul, he says. It's awful metaphor, I think, but a very powerful one, because he wants to be protected from killing disease, fatal disease, but he thinks you've got to go into the muck. You've got to go into the center of things. You've got to go into the world. And then you go back to the top of your pyramid, or you go, in his case, go back to your mother's house, and you write perfect sentences. You strive to get the art right. Flaubert's disillusionment is a turn to aesthetics. And that is really key for the development of modernism. Remember, Marx's disillusionment was a turn to economics. For Flaubert, it's a turn to the perfect sentence, to the laws of prose, if you want, and poetry. The really real for Marx was economics. The really real for Flaubert is art. He does say dissection is revenge. That is, I have skewered Homer. I have shown this, the dilemmas of Romanticism. And in his other books, he shows the hypocrisy of revolution and the stupidity of the bourgeoisie. He does that. He does dissect as a kind of criticism. But he was not going to be a partisan. He's not going to be a member of any club that's trying to change the world. His club, if I could put it this way, is the club of the greatest writers who've ever written. That's the club he wants to be in. He wants his prose to be deep in the world, but their form must be perfect. And form becomes the really real for modernism. And we'll see that in painting, and you'll see it in poetry, and you'll see it in a lot of the different areas where the really real is not historical change, but it's perfect artwork. And so from Flaubert, we will go on next time to talk about a very different dynamic as in English cultural history, and we're going to be focused on Charles Darwin. And then we'll come back to France to talk about Baudelaire, a writer that Flaubert admired, contemporary with Flaubert, who also was very interested in experimental form and even more interested than Flaubert in plunging into the real world, the world of the city. But what we see here is we move from the very, very political thinkers of Rousseau and Marx. Now we're towards the thinkers who are looking either to science, in Darwin's case, as we'll see next week, to art, for Flaubert and Baudelaire, as a way of dealing with modernity. See you next time.